I'm going to start by putting myself into the program. The best way to do that would be to organize information about me, the player. And to organize information, you use the method class. If I go class player and then I go public with that colon there, then I can list a whole bunch of attributes that this computer variable player will now hold. So I'm defining like an organization method for everything the player variable can contain. First thing we're going to contain is a location. So I'm going to abbreviate that by just going LOC and just location. The location is going to be a number, a whole number, and that whole number will be representing where I'm at within the program. So let's make a location. Let's put in an area. I'm going to make another computer variable, and it's going to contain the attribute ID, and that ID will be the representation of the number that corresponds to that location. The ID, right, so if my location is equal to the ID of this area, then it will mean that I'm in the same spot, or at least that's the plan. So how am I going to represent that within the program? First, I need to create a dynamic list. I need to define the elements that are going to be in this game, and you need to put those elements, those objects, into a list format. And a list in C++, lists are called vectors. And now I'm going to declare a vector of areas. So that's going to be the locations that my player can be within. So if I go vector and then a lesser than sign and then put in the name of the computer variable and then put a greater than sign, so I enclose the computer variable with a lesser and then greater than sign, then that's how you set what this dynamic list is going to be composed of. In our case, we're composing a dynamic list of areas. And we're going to call that so the name of this list is going to be rooms, and it's going to be composed of areas. And then I'm going to put myself into the game by using the name of the class that I created earlier, player, and then so this is a computer variable called me, and it's a computer variable of a player class. So now these two elements are in the program. I need to, for dynamic lists, you have to add already created objects. And what that means is I have to define one of these locations, one of these areas. So I'm going to go area. And then whenever I put things into a list, I like to go the name of the computer variable and then an S to stand for sample. So area sample. And then to access the attributes within the area, within the class or the computer variable area, you just put a dot. a period. And then you can access and modify the internal attributes. So areas have an ID number. I'm going to give this one the ID number of 1. And then I'm going to, so I just gave this, well, and then I'm going to put this area into the rooms list. So rooms.pushback. Pushback is the method, the function that you call to add objects to the dynamic list. And we are now putting in the area sample that I just set to the value 1. The ID I set to the value 1. So now it's inside the list. And then I'm going to set my location, the me variable I created earlier, to... And now, yeah, my location is equal to 1. The only room in the game is set to the value of 1. So we are now in the same location, but the computer doesn't know that until I make an evaluation to tell it to act as if that's the case. And really, there's no... Well, I got a dream of what that will look like, what it means to be in the same location. So the next step would be to create an algorithm expressing that I'm in that room. And to do that, I'm going to define a function. I'm going to create a set of code that will run when I call it, and I'm going to set it to void. So this is void narration. So void narration. Void just means that there's no return information. When you create a function, usually it returns a number, like the function main returns 0. It returns an integer, and you can see that because the function main is there's int main, and then there's 2 parentheses. So void nar parentheses means that I'm calling, there's going to be void. Void stands for null. There's no return with this function. So every time we loop through this piece of code here, the do loop, this is where the whole program is taking place. We're checking for the player's input, and then if I type end, the game ends. Before we check the input, we need to call the narration function that I just created. And to do that, you just go, well, you just type the function's name, the parentheses, and you put the inputs in if there's any inputs. There's no inputs here. Then down here, I'm setting up the code for narration. So when the function is called, this is the code that would follow afterwards. So this piece of code is a loop, and it's looping through the list that I created earlier, the rooms list. The room's dynamic list has a size associated to it. It's the size of how many items are in that list. But all lists in C++ start at 0. So over here, I go unsign int a equals 0, and I'm setting an integer to 0, and then I say if that integer is less than or equal to, no, if it's just if it's less than the room size, then would it proceed with the code? I forget if there needs to be, let's hold on. Would there need to be an equal sign here? 0. Oh, wait, no, the room size would be the amount of objects within the dynamic list. So right now, the dynamic list only has one object. So I set a to 0, and then if a is less than 1, then we'll run through the code, and at the end of the code, you add 1 to a, and then a becomes 1, and then a is not less than the room size anymore, and then the code doesn't continue. And what all this does is just loops through the rooms. Why we're doing this? So we're looping through the rooms, and then we're finding if we're checking to see if I'm in this room or not. So when I'm looping through this room, I gotta do it in the sense that rooms followed by this A right here. You can see the A. That A is right now is 0 on the first iteration. So this becomes 0, and then if there were 3 rooms, then it would become 1, 2, and then it wouldn't get to 3. When it gets to 3, 3 would not be less than 3, so it wouldn't run the code again. But this A inside the brackets right here calls upon the item within the list. So this would be referencing 0, the first item within the rooms list. And then it checks to see if my location is equal to the ID of that room. And then if it is, I'm just going to say and there you go. Let's see, I'm going to compile this. I'm gonna run. You're in a dark room. And then, yeah, so that code is running the way I would intend it to run. It tells us that, well, all right, so let's sum it up. What have I done? This was a hard video to make because there's so many intricate elements within coding that's hard to explain, but I have created 2 computer elements, the player and the area. And then I placed attributes within them, the location, and then the ID. The area computer variable, if I have the same number, if my location is equal to the area's number, then I'm within that room. So then I used the vector dynamic list to create a list of areas, and then I created the player class variable, me. Then I set a sample area up to place within the list, so I created an area, then I gave it the value 1, placed it within that list with the pushback feature, and then I I set my location to the location of the area that I placed in the dynamic list. Then I created a function with I created a function to narrate the situation that's happening. So a function, there it is. Then I call upon that function. So every time this set of code right here is running, it has to run narration, the narration function. Then in the narration function, it loops through these rooms, and in those rooms, it checks to see if I'm in one of those rooms. And then, there you go. Eventually, it does find that I'm in one of those rooms, and then it reads out this line of this code right here. And we're going to add more and more complex algorithms as time goes on, but this is the very beginning of how you would start setting up a ginormous simulator. It seems very like a lot of code just to do something simple, but now we're going to be able to add things to those rooms, travel from one room to another room, generate rooms under certain circumstances. It can get very interesting very fast. But that's enough for this video. The next video will continue on.